Welcome to America at a Crossroads. It's our 103rd consecutive week of programming. Welcome from Jews United for Democracy and Justice and from Community Advocates, Inc. And from our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lair, and myself. Tonight, we launched this series within a series, the first of 3 programs entitled An Expert's View of a Topsy-Turvy World. For part 1, we are very pleased to welcome former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, retired Admiral Mike Mullen, in conversation with the always wonderful Warren Olney. Thank you both for being with us. This week is Yom HaZikaron, which is Israeli Memorial Day, and it commemorates soldiers who died fighting in Israel's War of Independence. Yom HaZikaron literally melds right into Yom HaAtzmaut, which is Israeli Independence Day. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken extended birthday wishes to Israel today and spoke of the unbreakable bond between United States and Israel. Blinken also said he looks forward to continuing our work to create a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East. We note both of these important days and add our prayers for peace and security for Israel and her neighbors. Next week for Topsy-Turvy Part 2, we will host the brilliant and always insightful Bret Stephens in conversation with Pat Morrison. And if you haven't read today's New York Times op-ed, which Stephens wrote in the form of a letter to 4 of the Supreme Court justices about the now infamous leaked draft opinion, I suggest you read it. It was in the email we sent out this afternoon and will be republished in the email we send out right after the program. On May 18th, we take a break from Topsy-Turvy. Maybe really we will take a break from a Topsy-Turvy. I guess stranger things have happened, but we'll take a break from the series to hear from Ambassador Dennis Ross, who in conversation with Larry Mantle will analyze the diplomatic ripple effects of the Russo-Ukraine war. This has been another unusual and stressful week. Are there any other kinds these days? The news from the Supreme Court, the war in Ukraine, the results of the various primary elections, to name just a few of the events this week. In the next several weeks, America at a Crossroads will be addressing all of these issues. We are working diligently to bring you the most knowledgeable speakers each Wednesday during our hour together. And now David Lair will tell you more about what's coming up. David?
Thank you, Janice. Welcome to you all. Tonight's a very special program with a familiar name and a familiar face. Someone who was omnipresent on our TV screens and in the newspapers for 4 years. We host the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was our country's top military man and is a renowned naval expert, especially salient at a time when naval strategy is becoming critical in the Russo-Ukraine war. He'll be introduced in a minute. In addition to the next 2 weeks' guests, whom Janice has mentioned, on May 25th, we will host the former Secretary of Defense and former Chief of the CIA, Leon Panetta. Secretary Panetta was with us in December 2020 when the world was a very different place. His expertise and experience will be fascinating to learn from, and tonight's host, Warren Olney, will be interviewing the Secretary that evening. In coming weeks, we will host the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist David Brooks and trailblazing social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. He'll discuss his new book, Life After Babel, Adapting to a World We May Never Again Share. Insightful discussions all. It's now my pleasure to introduce a longtime friend, our most frequent moderator, and a much honored journalist for his decades of work on television and radio, KCRW's amazing Warren Olney. Warren?
Thank you, David, very much. And I am very happy to welcome back Admiral Mike Mullen. As you indicated, he was chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during Barack Obama's first administration. That was after commanding the U.S. Naval Forces Europe, the Allied Joint Force Command in Naples, and being Vice Chief of Naval Operations. He's one of just 3 naval officers to have held so many senior positions. When he headed the military, he implemented President Obama's change in policy toward gays in the armed forces. He is now a visiting professor at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. This is my second chance to interview him for America at a Crossroads, and I am privileged once again to do so. Admiral, it's great to have you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Warren. It's great to be back with you and Janice and David, and I really do appreciate the opportunity.
You may be retired, but your government service is not over. In March, you were sent by President Biden to go to Taiwan, and you said there that the U.S. stands firm behind its commitments to Taiwan. China, of course, has pledged to retake that island, and Beijing denounced your presence, warned the U.S. to stay out. We don't recognize Taiwan. What are those commitments that you said we will keep?
Well, one of the things that, and particularly when you take a trip like that, I did an awful lot of studying in a very short period of time. And I was very much taken by the structure of the relationship, which really started with a communique that Nixon signed in 1972 and hinges off of something called the Taiwan Relations Act, which President Carter signed in 1979. And we just went through the 43rd anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act last month in April. In addition to the communique that, excuse me, that Nixon signed, Carter signed one in 79, and then Reagan signed a third communique in 1982. And the point of all that is there's been a bipartisan approach to support Taiwan literally since that time frame. And we've done that supporting, the one China policy. There are what they call also 6 assurances, and I won't go into those, but one of them is that the United States would not negotiate an outcome here. That's to be decided between Taiwan and mainland China. What struck me though, Warren, was how long this structure has actually not just existed, but allowed the support and basically keeping very much the status quo, if you will, so that China, mainland China and Taiwan can figure out how they want to do this in the future. We have pledged support. We've sent them arms packages, we, the United States, over many, many years, and that continues to this day. What is going on now, though, is a very, and I'll use Hong Kong as an example. Hong Kong obviously has changed dramatically in the last several years, and there's great concern that that same kind of taking, if you will, could eventually happen with respect to mainland China. Mainland China just pushes back on every single aspect of Taiwan globally. What I also found, which was very instructive, is a couple of years ago, China Lithuania opened a Taiwan office. And where you do that throughout the world, that's typically called a Taipei office. Well, the president of Lithuania decided it was going to be the Taiwan audience. And then China really lashed out at Lithuania, hurt them economically, fiscally. And the European continent really stood up to that and backfilled, if you will, Lithuania. And subsequent to that, there have been many members of the EU Parliament who have visited Taiwan in recognition of the need for support. So their support is now much more global than it used to be. And certainly the United States is a big part of that. Taiwan is 24 million Taiwanese. It is a very, very democratic, principled, valued group of people and government and island. And it is one, from my perspective, that we need to support. If we can't support a democracy like Taiwan, what democracies will we support?
I want to get to Ukraine, and I'm sure the audience wants me to as well. But before we do, if China were to attempt to take Taiwan, are we committed to trying to prevent that? Will we do the same thing we're doing, for example, at least it may be indirectly, with Ukraine?
The policy that has been out there forever, Warren, is one called strategic ambiguity. It's in that strategic ambiguity, which has sort of kept us in pretty good shape. We have sent many signals that we will be very supportive of Taiwan. And the question you ask is the same question, that actually the Taiwanese people have asked constantly. And certainly from my perspective, there's an awful lot of support here on both sides of the aisle at a time where both sides of the aisle don't support much together anymore, to support Taiwan. The specific if China in fact tried to take Taiwan through something called an amphibious landing, which is the most complex military operation known to man, certainly there would be great pushback. The specifics of how we do that, or whether when we do that and all, is really not for me to say. That said, we need to send a very strong message so that China doesn't actually physically invade Taiwan. So that actually never happens.
Any coincidence that this happened during the war in Ukraine?
Well, I got called from the White House to go do this. Certainly it was It was tied. This was the first or second week, I think. And I think strategically, that was the intent, was certainly one of very strong support. I will tell you that the president of Taiwan, President Tsai, an extraordinarily capable woman, was delighted to have us, was delighted to see that actually a country could fight for itself. She was looking at Ukraine because they'll have to do that. But she was also delighted to see that other countries would come to support a country like Ukraine, and was actually buoyed by that as well. So there's certainly an expectation that support hopefully will grow. There literally are only 14 countries in the world that recognize Taiwan officially, and they need all the support they can get.
Before we go any further, I want to ask you this about the nature of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the targeting of civilians from the air, the atrocities reportedly committed by the troops on the ground. You are a lifelong warrior. What is your judgment of this way of making war?
Well, first of all, in many ways, it's the Russian way. And I think part of the perspective of where we are right now with this goes back, literally hundreds and hundreds of years. I think about, and even before this started, the worry for me was things like Stalingrad, things like Grozny under Putin, like Aleppo under Putin, where he just leveled the city. My own sense of what he wanted to do was to sort of get Kyiv to roll over quickly, take over the country, replace the government, and have it be done. Obviously, he didn't anticipate a couple of things. One, how poorly his force is fighting, and how well, the other thing is how well the Ukrainians are fighting. So he's obviously regrouped now, but my expectation, this will continue. You and I have, over the course of our lives, have seen a lot of war, which is sad, but it's part of what's happened on the planet, certainly over the course of our lifetimes. What has struck me about this war is we're almost seeing it live. I mean, just because of all the connectivity, all the films, whatever the case might be, you see this, and war is always awful. It is always devastating. I think Putin in particular has absolutely no qualms to do whatever he thinks he needs to do, to include killing innocent women and children and civilians without a thought, and that's going to continue.
But you say that's the Russian way. It's not just Putin.
No, that's correct. I think, it's very difficult to understand what's going on in Putin's head. But I believe, and I've talked to others that feel the same way, that he is just obsessed with Russian history. I mean, going back before the Soviet Union kind of thing, with restoring the Russian, the Russian Empire, if you will, which would include Belarus and Ukraine, et cetera. That's his obsession, and I don't think anything will stop him. I've said from the beginning of this, I think Putin won't stop. He needs to be stopped, and if he isn't stopped, he will keep gobbling up other spots. I mean, there's huge concern down the road for the Baltics. And I've got a lot of experience in that part of the world. Even on their best day after they joined NATO, they were nervous about Russia. The same is true with places like Transnistria and Moldova, et cetera. And when you see, the move, I spent a lot of time, in NATO, and when you look at Finland and Sweden, thinking very seriously, from what I can tell, about joining NATO, it's an extraordinary time, and it's a reminder of the dynamics on that continent that go back throughout history. And I think that Putin is very focused on that from a Russian standpoint.
I just forgot to mention to the audience, and first of all, welcome to all of you in the audience, that you can submit your questions to David Lehrer. I'm not sure anybody said that at the outset, and he will email them to me. And after I've chatted with the Admiral for a while, I will read your questions to him as well. So I just wanted to remind you of that. Let's take a look at the naval operations. It has been reported that Russia is losing that aspect of the war to Ukraine, even though Ukraine really doesn't have a navy anymore. Is that right? Is that your assessment as well?
Well, it wouldn't be. I'm not sure losing, and I don't know how. I don't know the breadth and the depth of the quote unquote operations. The loss of that cruiser, the Russian cruiser, was a stunning event. It was the flagship. It's an old ship, but it's the flagship of the Russian fleet, certainly in the Black Sea. And one of my worries in the regrouping that Russia's doing right now is that eventually Putin will be focused on trying to just secure everything between Mariupol all the way over to Odessa and essentially cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. And my own view of that is we can't let that happen. And the way that does, that has to not happen ashore, but there's also a real need to make sure that operations in the Black Sea, pushing back on the Russians, knowing that and other navies, quite frankly, are very strong in that regard, I think is really important. Just briefly back to that, back to the sinking of that cruiser, to have a ship that size sink that quickly. It registers a couple things. One is the possible incompetence of the military in the Navy as well as in the Army, as we've looked at with the Russians. Two, there could have been a massive, what I would call a secondary explosion in one of their magazines, which just opened it up. I toured that class of ship back in 1992 on a visit to a Russian port up north, and I was struck in my tour is how limited the firefighting equipment was, throughout the ship. It was just an observation. If you go to a U.S. Navy ship, you see firefighting equipment literally in every passageway. That was not the case on the Kira, and it was just something that I noted at the time. So you wonder whether they also fell far short in their ability to fight a fire or to fight a flood, once they'd been hit. But it was an extraordinary occurrence in my own judgment.
Well, apparently they have lost a lot of other ships as well, amphibious ships, as I understand it, so that it's argued that the Black Sea Fleet probably isn't able to concentrate and perform a landing, which you said is one of the most complex operations that there is. So do you think that it's possible that the Ukrainians or the Russians are weak enough that the Ukrainians might be able to ship food out? Because obviously that's one of the major problems of this war has created.
I think that's, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that yet, Warren. I was struck when this whole thing started, and this is just level of knowledge for me, at how much of a breadbasket Ukraine is to the rest of the world. I looked at some early analysis that talked about the amount of wheat. I think it's 25% of the wheat market when combined with Russia or something like that. The soybean piece, the grain piece, and the impact on other countries, Lebanon, Libya, Yemen, countries who are suffering from food insecurity, if you will, as this was about to happen. And clearly that has also now been very much exposed. The way, at least from what I've read, the likelihood I think that lane will open up quickly, I think is pretty slim, at least in the near future. There's going to be a very big fight on the eastern side of Ukraine, and it's going to be nasty. It'll be visible. It'll be more of what you've seen, and I think the way Russia's going to, to fight this is along the lines of what we've seen, just crushing everything. Even as bad as they've been, they can still do that if they have a strength, and you could argue maybe they don't anymore, but if they have a strength, it is in that artillery, that long-range artillery, the rocket piece, and they will continue to devastate those cities. It's also instructive to me that in Mariupol, those fighters they can't dig them out. They just can't dig them out, which is extraordinary. So it is this combination of incompetence on the Russian side and this extraordinary performance and an extraordinary competence level from the Ukrainian side, which has gotten us to this point. But I do worry whether the Ukrainians will be able to sustain that, in this fight for the eastern part of Ukraine.
You talk about the Russian way, and now you're talking about incompetence. Did the U.S. misjudge the outset of the war? President Biden appeared to believe that maybe Russia would, in fact, be able to walk in and grab it as had happened in Crimea. Was there a misjudgment by American intelligence at the outset, do you think?
Well, it's hard for me to know that exactly. I mean, one of the things I didn't really know, because I just hadn't been involved in it, Warren, is since Crimea, there's been a pretty significant training effort on the part of the United States, the Brits, and a couple other countries to work with the Ukrainians, where they were very bad in the Crimean fight. And you look at where they are right now. So to say that we didn't understand what Crimea might be able to do if they had the weapons is probably a stretch. I think we understood they could probably do a whole lot better. I mean, at least from my perspective, and many I've talked to, nobody expected the Russians to be so bad. Now, I was in the chairman's job in 2008 when Russia went into Georgia, and I was really stunned at how bad they were then. But since that time, and they just use mass and force, and quite frankly, turning the place to as much rubble as possible until they got their way. And that's what I expected, some version of that. I just expected in this war, I expected them to be a whole lot better, and they were awful. They are clearly not geared for this kind of war. I also had you've certainly heard, we've all heard about their conscripts and the difficulty that they've had, with their people. The number of senior officers who've been killed is extraordinary, quite frankly. And I think the Brits published recently, they've lost possibly up to 15,000 troops. And usually, the number that are wounded is 5 to 10 times more than that. At least that's a metric that I've used. And the wounded are all going home to talk about this as well, which probably won't go well. So they're a good friend of mine who is from Russia, migrated from Russia with his parents, said the Russians would really fight. You couldn't touch them if it was for their own land. They don't do so well fighting for somebody else's land, and certainly that seems to have proved out so far.
Let me ask you about America's fight for another land. The New York Times opinion editor says today that if this next $33 billion goes through Congress, the United States will have authorized a total of $46.6 billion for the war, and that is equal to more than 2/3 of Russia's entire annual defense budget. The Defense Secretary Austin says we want to see Russia weakened. Was that a red line of some kind? Has this become a proxy war?
Well, it's hard to say that it isn't a proxy war. I mean, if you laid out the definition, it's pretty close. I actually was a little taken back when Secretary Austin said that. It doesn't mean I wouldn't want him to do that. I do want Russia to be weakened when this is over. I'm not sure inciting Putin, if you will, with that kind of statement, can make it much more challenging with respect to that. I'm a little less concerned about the dollar comparison. I mean, if we're in this thing to the degree we are, and we are doing much better in terms of support than we did at the beginning, we need to be in big. We need to be, and as someone else told me today, scouring all our friends for all the T-55, T-72 tanks in Bulgaria and Romania, et cetera. We need to be doing everything we possibly can to help the Ukrainians win. To say that's not a proxy war, that becomes pretty difficult. Where you just don't want to go, and I'm not sure I agree with President Biden saying this is what we're not going to do, but we don't want to turn this into World War III. Clearly, it's just too dangerous, and it's the discussion about the use of nuclear weapons and the moving from tactical nuclear weapons, which have a much smaller but very devastating footprint, than the strategic nuclear weapons. And I worry. Back in the day, in the 80s, in that time frame, we all looked at the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons because Russia had so many, but there was no discussion that would lead to the strategic nuclear weapons piece. Now, because it's been absent from the discussion for so long, it's too easy to go from one to the other right now, and we can't let that happen. We can't let this turn into a world ending as we know it confrontation, and that's the tough part right now, particularly when Putin seems to be doing much more poorly over time. I've heard from the beginning, and I still hear today, what kind of off-ramp is there for Putin? How does this end in a way where he actually steps off in a way that he comes out with something that makes sense? what's the end state here that's acceptable, at this particular point in time, and how do we negotiate that, which I think is critical far before we get to a point where World War III breaks out.
How much do you know about the command and control structure regarding tactical nuclear weapons in Russia? It's my understanding that in the United States at the moment, you practically have to go to the president of the United States before, yeah, I think you do, to
You do
use one. Whereas in Russia, I have seen it reported, a battlefield commander might be able to launch one, or at least somebody that's lower in the chain of command than the guy at the top.
I don't think that even there they would do that without Putin approving it, because it's such a significant step. That doesn't mean it wouldn't physically be possible or somebody couldn't let one loose, but it's hard for me to believe that at least initially that he wouldn't be in on that in terms of what was going on. It's very difficult. I mean, part of the challenge that we have right now is understanding who's talking to Putin, who's he listening to. It's a very, very small circle that he's listening to. I think very few people, if anybody, knows what's really going on in his head. I heard today that he's apparently he's spending an hour with either a mystic religious type, an hour a day, et cetera. And this goes back to sort of, I said, the obsession with the history, if you will, even preceding the time of the Soviet Union. So that's that early picture with Putin sitting down at the end of the table all by himself, I think was very, very reflective of where he is. Hugely isolated. He's not a guy you want to bring bad news to, and so how all of that would happen, including using a nuke, it's just hard for me to believe that one of the military leaders would use that and even take the risk without getting his permission.
Back to the idea of tactical nuclear weapons, you said that they are less than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but still extraordinarily devastating. Can you describe it? I mean, how much devastation could one do with a single tactical nuclear weapon? Could you wipe out a city with it?
Maybe one of the ways to think about this is, and I was pretty engaged in this when Fukushima happened in Japan in 2011. And the radiation that was released from that reactor basically made that area for years, you couldn't get in it. You couldn't live in it anymore. And now that's mitigated somewhat, over a decade later, but that's just one example. And I've heard a couple of thoughts on the tactical. One is sort of the battlefield weapon. So it's out in the battlefield, it's not downtown somewhere. But that would clearly, if it hit anything or anything were exposed to it, it'd be evaporated. I mean, there's a book a friend of mine told me to read a few years ago called The Last Train from Hiroshima by Charles Pellegrino, which talks about literally the medical impacts, the physical impacts of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are they're just devastating. Beyond description how devastating these weapons are. If it's not the battlefield piece, if it's go into a city, it would turn that tactical nuclear weapon, it would turn that footprint, into a place where you couldn't go for years, or either forever. I mean, you heard early in this discussion the Russians, which baffle me, they went into Chernobyl. Chernobyl is still problematic, these many years later, decades later, if you will. But that's the enormity of the nuclear radiation and what it does. I mean, it is such a giant step up to use a weapon like this. And I only could imagine him doing it, if he were really desperate. That said, the Western view of this and not using it is somewhat counseled by the fact that the United States has been the only one that ever used these weapons. I don't think that he's counseled by that very much. I think the likelihood that he would use one of these weapons is higher from his perspective than we would think it would be if we were analyzing and looking at him. in a way. And part of it goes back to just, how he thinks and what he'll devastate and what he wants to do. He's going to be a pariah. How much more of a pariah can you be, when this is done? The Russian country is going to be a different country. The European security structure, I think the global security structure is going to be vastly changed as a result of this. Xi Jinping signed up with him, on February 4th, friends for life kind of thing. I don't know that Xi Jinping read the fine print to include, I'm going to go into Ukraine here shortly. Or if he did, the fine print probably said, I'll be in and out in a few days. It won't be a big deal. And I think China's going to stay with Putin. So, from my perspective, Warren, we're sort of back on two fronts. It's going to be a two-front. I would hope two fronts to deter war, but certainly we're going to need to be able to, if required, fight it on two different fronts. And we haven't even talked about the Middle East, which is another part of the world that doesn't go away.
But what about the Middle East, and what about the role of Middle Eastern countries, particularly Israel, with regard to Ukraine, and what ramifications are there in the Middle East as a result of what's going on in Ukraine?
Well, one of the things I worry about as we've pulled back, the United States has pulled back from the Middle East, and the leaders in the Middle East are also survivors. And in fact, a couple of them are much closer to Putin than I'd like them to be, quite frankly. And these used to be close friends of ours, specifically the UAE, as well as MBS in Saudi Arabia. Although I've been told that MBS is sort of questioning that right now, not so much in the UAE. Very close to Putin. I think clearly because of the resources, and one of the things we've talked about in America for the last few years is that we're energy independent. As you can see just from this crisis, that is just not the case. Yes, we're the biggest producer of oil, but we don't control the price. And we're not going to do that. Saudi Arabia is going to do that for a long time into the future. So we have to pay attention to the Middle East. And also China, in many ways, China is like us many, many years ago. They are going to be a huge consumer of energy. And the Middle East is a huge pot of that, if you will, for as far as I can see into the future. So that realignment, it's about that realignment. And then specifically with respect to Israel, I think we need to, it's a very close relationship. We care about each other a lot, and we need to, my own view is we need to continue to protect that and provide the kind of support to protect that. And then at the heart of that in the Middle East is obviously Iran. And where does that go? Where does Iran go, long term? And so I think staying engaged is important. I don't think that we, the US need to be as exposed in that part of the world or as dependent on that part of the world as we used to be, particularly with the challenges we now have in the European continent, as well as the long-term challenges with China.
There's been a lot of concern in Europe about cutting off Russian oil, and Germany has been an issue, and apparently they're going to phase it out rather than do anything rapidly. Could the Middle East be helpful in that regard? Could we get Middle East oil into Europe, into Germany and other countries?
Yeah, I think they could. Whether they would or not is another question. I will say, for Chancellor Scholz, I was quite frankly stunned that he would turn against his politics literally in the first month that he was in the office to do what he has done. And I think sometimes we're too critical on his ability to detach from Russia, but he appears to be committed to that. It's not going to happen overnight. And Germany is a strong ally, and I think we need to support him in that regard. But I think he has set a great example, particularly, again, going against his own politics so early in office. But I don't think we can go back to a Russia we are all so dependent on. I don't for oil and for gas. I mean, gas is really the big one, and there appears to be an awful lot of effort to look at ways to do that as quickly as possible. I also think, Warren, And people don't talk about this much. I mean, when we hear about World War II, we talk about all the sacrifice, all of citizens in so many countries made. I think there's going to have to be some sacrifice to get this alignment right in the future, to protect our security, support our allies. And if we get this wrong, we're going to have Russian troops on the Polish border. You know, there's a 1939 message there, which is not insignificant. And that doesn't, I think in the long run, once Putin's gone, we have to figure out how to incorporate Russia into the future of the European continent in ways that make sense, maybe security-wise, maybe economically, et cetera. That's probably too much to ask right now, given what Putin has done. That's why I think the architecture in the globe, particularly with where China is, you asked about Taiwan. You know, Japan is now much more supportive, vocally supportive of Taiwan. So is Australia. I think that security architecture is going to have to change, and we're going to have to invest, if you will, to make sure that happens. We're going to have to be able to do them more than one or maybe even more than two things at a time.
Let me give the audience a chance to chime in, at least indirectly here. Admiral Michael Baker asks, why is the UN Security Council so ineffectual? The rules of the UN empower 9 members of the council to act and require that any nation involved in the dispute shall abstain. How do you explain that?
Well, this wouldn't be the first time that the UN was, sort of put in the, I don't think they're in the crosshairs in this, but in terms of because of the global aspect of who they are, herding all those cats, even at the at the UN Security Council is very difficult, particularly when China and Russia get a vote. I mean, that's where we started this a long time ago, and we're stuck with that. Should we change that? I actually don't think at this point to remove Russia, which, from participating in the Security Council, which I think would be a great idea, that actually probably has to come from the General Assembly, as opposed to the Security Council itself. The other thing is, and this is sort of, again, a Western view, in engagements I've had, I mean, there's been a lot of press about countries that are not taking Russia on, whether they're in Africa or Latin America, in other parts of the world, and where it gets fed back to us as Americans is they look at us as someone that invaded Iraq and really devastated that country. So who are we, the US, if you will, to have it right? Now, our leadership now is critical, and I think the administration has really done well with respect to this crisis. Over time, they got off to a little slow start, but I think they really have done well. But we need to also recognize that. So in this case, I thought Secretary General's visit to Kyiv the other day was important. The fact that he went to Moscow was important, and to some degree, it becomes a little bit of a bully pulpit in terms of raising people to push in the right direction, if you will. And I think the UN can also be hugely impactful on the humanitarian side of all this, by staying with this as well. But it's not an organization that has, a deep reputation, particularly in a combat situation, for generating great outcomes.
Before I go back to the email, you mentioned the visit of the Secretary of General Guterres to Kyiv. Nancy Pelosi went there too. Why do you suppose that the Russians essentially allowed that to happen? And why haven't they taken out more bridges, more railroads, more supply lines by which weaponry is being introduced into the country and so on? Why do you suppose that is? Is that incompetence, or do they want waiting around until they take over?
I think if you go back to where most of that is happening, it's east. It's west. It's on the western half of the country, and that's where just about everything comes in. A lot of it comes in through Poland. A visit like Pelosi's would be well under the radar, and literally until she was there. Yeah. And the security aspect of that, I can tell you, it would be exceptionally high. I'm sure it was exceptionally high. Yeah. And then if you look at how incompetent the Russians were on that side of Ukraine, Kyiv, et cetera, they don't have any way of securing that right now. They've certainly proved that. So I think the ability to do if they were there and if they'd taken Kyiv, and then I think we'd be having a different conversation about support. You know, how would you get it in? But right now, that's where it's coming through by and large, and it's from what I can see, certainly it's unimpeded by what Russia is doing.
Here's Tom. He wants to ask this: what could dissuade Russia from doing to the Baltic states what they have done to Ukraine?
What could what? Sorry.
What could dissuade Russia from doing to the Baltic states what they have done to Ukraine?
I honestly believe, and this is dealing with autocrats and dictators, I think you just have to, now is a very decisive moment, really, literally now, the next month or so in the East. And the Russians really need to take a beating there. And that beating, if you will, could well dissuade them that we may not want to try this again. That gets back to what I said earlier. I think they need to be stopped. I don't think they will stop. If somehow we get into a negotiated outcome, it's almost like, you know, we did Georgia, we did Crimea, and now we'll do Ukraine, and then we'll take a break. But, you know, we won't go further. I think the pain and the devastation to Russia itself, and I think I saw something earlier today that said, you know, they've already lost 25% of their GDP, you know, since the invasion started. You know, the impact on the country, it has to be those kinds of things, quite frankly, that convinces them enough is enough, as well as we need to be more forward with our troops. I think this is Mike Mullen talking. I'm not in a position to decide or even recommend. I think we're going to have more troops, more U.S. troops in Europe. I think we'll have them up against, you know, in Poland and Bulgaria and Romania on the eastern, you know, on the eastern front, if you will, which also would go a long way if it's done in strength to dissuading Putin from taking the next step.
Jane wants to know, given the devastation that relatively small weapons have done to Russia's ships, and particularly the major one that you mentioned earlier, are our huge ships at risk? We got a lot of aircraft carriers.
Well, there are no aircraft carriers in the Black Sea.
No, but I
mean,
think she means it in a more general sense.
Yeah, there are certainly those that are concerned that the carriers are very vulnerable. The only thing I can say about that, Warren, is, I mean, we've been in this business for a long time. We understand they are big ships and people come after them. We've got pretty good intelligence about what that means. We also develop both tactics and technical capabilities to counter that. We're well aware of the possible threat. And so I wouldn't say a whole lot more about how vulnerable they are. They are enormously capable platforms that bring combat power. I mean, they bring a lot of presence and visible power, et cetera, what I would call deterrence. But if you get into combat, they bring an enormous combat capability that people underestimate. And it can move and it can be where you want it to be, you know, in any ocean in the world. So I recognize the threats are out there. Those of us that have been in CRO life, we've always had those kinds of threats, and we do the best we can to deal with them. But it's not, I would say, and try to be convincing in this, it's not time for them to go away. And because if we did that, when we do that, they're done. We're not coming back. So when that decision gets made, and at some point in time down the road it may, that needs to be a very obvious decision, and we're just not there right now.
Here's Ingrid, speaking of intelligence. What are the implications of the New York Times report this evening that the U.S. supplied the intelligence to the Ukrainians that helped knock off so many of their generals?
I don't think this would be the first time that there's a report out that we're sharing intelligence. I will say, and again, I want to give the Biden administration credit for this, the release of intelligence, particularly early in this campaign, which completely befuddled the Russians and Putin, and the whole disinformation thing was an extraordinary step. And I want to give, I mean, I give the president credit for this, but I also want to give the intelligence community credit for letting this go, because they do not do that easily. They protect their sources and methods to a fairly well. That has had an extraordinary impact. That we are sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians, I think has been out there for some time. If it hasn't, this shouldn't be news, quite frankly, specifically. Maybe maybe a better way to say it is specifically to target the leadership, the military leadership, you know, that obviously could be news. But what I can say broadly, I mean, what I know, and I don't know anything about the specifics of the intelligence sharing, but I do know that we are sharing it with them. And if that report is accurate, that would be part of the sharing.
Here's sort of a basic kind of question from Diana. She says the U.S. keeps saying we're only going to send defensive weapons to Ukraine. Is there really a distinction between offensive and defensive weaponry?
Well, I think in this sense, yes, that we would be sending weapons to protect the Ukrainians. The offensive side would be, you know, literally starting to go long into Russia, which you know, physically we're not very far from that border, meaning the Ukrainians aren't. But it really is from the protection standpoint. But we also live in a time, honestly, cyber is one example, but where offense and defense can get blended pretty quickly. So I wouldn't want to be, you know, too prescriptive, if you will, but by and large, these are defensive weapons to protect the fighters, as well as the citizens, the cities, et cetera, that we've sent them, and used to stop. I mean, basically, the Ukrainians are on defense. I mean, the Russians are coming at them, and they've got to be stopped. So from that standpoint, they are defensive.
They claim that in many cases they have been on offense. Is that just sort of a boost of?
Well, I think I think that's probably true, and that's probably true tactically, if you will. You know, in certain engagements, they have been extraordinary in their ability to take out the Russians, to do what some call scoot and shoot. You know, the javelin weapons, looking at a tank, you let the weapon go and you move so that they can't target you or where the weapon came from, for example, as one capability. It's, you know, they really have been exceptional. And I wouldn't want to, I think if we were going to give them really offensive weapons, you would know what an offensive weapon was, and it would be going a lot deeper than it is right now.
But it wouldn't be a tactical nuclear weapon.
No.
Mark wants to know, what is your assessment of President Zelensky's leadership qualities? Does that kind of resolve make a difference for the troops?
I think actually Zelensky will go down in history as one of the great wartime leaders, certainly over the course of my life. It does. I mean, he is just a walking, breathing, living example of what a difference leadership makes. And his ability to capture and generate the willpower to fight, you know, I think it's from what, 15 or 16 to 60, you know, every able-bodied male in Ukraine is in the fight one way or another. And to be connected, to be out there, to be personally courageous, you know, I mean, literally there, he's not going anywhere. It's just been extraordinary, and not unlike what I said earlier, because we've seen this war almost live. You see him almost live in terms of what a difference a great leader can make, and it's just extraordinary. And that gets, you know, that's despite the fact he was a comedian. I get all that. But, you know, from my perspective, he's been doing this long enough now, and at such a high level. You know, that's ancient history. He really has been extraordinary.
Elliot has a question about the guy on the other side. Are there any signs that Putin's military leaders might have had enough of him and might rebel in some way?
No, not that I've seen. And you know, how does I think Putin's got to go. I sort of put who can get rid of him in three buckets. One, it's the Russian people, and that's one of the reasons I talked about the wounded going back. And secondly, it's the military leadership, could they? And third, it's the oligarchs. Putin knows that. And he has, before this war started, he has insulated and isolated himself so that he can survive a long time. So when people ask me how long this is going to go, it's going to go a while, and Putin's going to be there a while, longer than, not just longer than we'd like, I think longer than any of us would expect. That's what survivors and dictators and autocrats are best at, surviving. So how bad does it have to get for one of those three bins or buckets to turn on him? A lot worse than it is right now.
You talked about soldiers coming home. You've mentioned it a couple of times from the war, wounded soldiers particularly, and turning people against the war when they come back. But what about the media control that Putin has? And it sounds to me that if a pollster asks you if you feel that whether you're against the war, you say you are. It sounds like it might be a crime that can get you put in jail. I mean, it's really, really a very repressive crackdown.
There's no question about that. So that gets back to, will the people take him out? Do they know what's going on? They don't, by and large. His popularity, I've read, several times since this started, his popularity has gone up. The Russian people, for the most part, believe Putin's narrative. I've got a friend who wakes up every morning and reads the Russian newspapers. That it really is on the U.S. and the U.S. caused all this.
Yeah.
So all of that, as unbelievable as that is, it's believable there, and that propaganda is very, very effective. All that speaks to the length of time it's going to take for this thing to turn in another direction. Now there is the possibility, and I don't know where this goes, of this May 9th celebration, and will he have anything in hand where he can sort of end this thing satisfied? Let's say this is back to, how does this end? This, basically in control of Donetsk, control of Luhansk, control of the East, if you will, up to a point, and say, look, this is what I really set out to do initially, and I've won. I don't know the likelihood of that, but that May 9th date keeps coming time and time again. But the likelihood that the people are going to turn him out anytime soon is, I think, very, very slim.
I've seen reports that on May 9th, he might announce a declaration of war. Does that mean anything? I couldn't understand why that would be predicted. It seems to me the war is already underway.
Well, I don't disagree with that, Warren, and I'm not sure it means a whole lot, except you may recall as he started this, he called it a select military operation.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even remember, there was some term, I would call it cute term, that this wasn't a war or an invasion. It was just this military operation. So I would think if he declares war on the 9th of May, that's an upgrade, if you will. That's a more significant step. That it seems to me he would then be willing to do more, if you will, given that's the state he would find himself in, whatever that meant, whatever that could mean.
Ed wants to know, is there any argument to be made for taking the war to Russia and getting offensive ourselves?
I don't think so, not at this point. I do worry what I talked about earlier about, I mean, look at how bad they've been. And then you threaten their country. I mean, literally you threaten the leadership, the people, et cetera. Then I think we're very, very close to World War III. And I don't think getting close to that's worth it at this point.
And World War III, when we talk about that, that really means not just the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That means a real exchange of major.
And I think that brings it very much into play. Is the strategic nuclear weapons, which, just to remind, those are weapons of mass destruction. Those are the end of Earth weapons, if you will. That I actually thought a few years ago, let's say 10 years ago, I negotiated the last New START treaty with my military counterpart. I thought we'd sort of put those aside. We'd move beyond that. That was wrapped. Soviet Union's gone. We'd started to reduce the numbers, both that we had as well as the Russians had, et cetera. It was headed in that direction. And now when at least I think about World War III, sadly, you bring those weapons back into play.
Speaking of treaties, Peter wants to know, and we talked about the Middle East earlier, what's happening with the Iran nuclear deal? Is there any progress in that? Is that important at this point?
There's been a lot of progress. It is, from what I understand, it's pretty close in terms of doing the deal. Right now, it is stuck because on the fact that the Iranians want the IRGC, that's the Revolutionary Guard, to include a much more difficult group called the Quds Force, which is their very special, very evil force inside the IRGC. Iran wants them taken off the terrorist list, which President Trump put them on. They are the only, as far as I know it, they're the only military force, if you will, put on the terrorist list, and that the administration is not anxious to do that. And it's, other than that, it's close. My own view of that is we need to do the deal, if you will. I recognize it's challenging. The last one was challenging, but I'll take 10 more years without Iran developing a nuclear weapon, and then work the next 10 years to see what's next after that. What I do worry about, I worried about it back then, I worry about it now, that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and they've now generated an awful lot of highly enriched uranium, I think it's 60% enriched, and once you get beyond 20%, it doesn't take you very long to get to 100% of what you need. They've got a lot more than they had before. And if they get a nuclear weapon, then I'm starting to look at Saudi, Turkey, Egypt, UAE, questions and get raised in Japan, in South Korea. And so we're going in exactly the wrong direction. So that's one of the reasons I think the deal is so important.
Is President Trump partly responsible for that, for having gotten out of the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I mean, he had a view that it wasn't a good deal, and it had its challenges. Iran has not started. There's two other aspects to Iran. One is their missile force, if you will, and secondly is just the terrorist activities they support. And at the end of the deal that President Obama was putting together, those two aspects got thrown in, and now there's a debate about which is why one of the significant reasons President Trump pulled out, because that wasn't included. And Iran's a bad actor. There's no question about that. Now the question is how much. They're still doing a lot of that. How much more of that do we include in this deal? And I do think this deal is still fairly limited in that regard. That said, to not include those other things, we can deal with those other activities, if you will, the missile activity, the terrorist activity, which is not insignificant, outside the deal. It's back to, these weapons are so devastating. We need to do all we can to take them off the table, which is one of the reasons I support, making the deal.
We got 2 minutes left. Alan wants to know this. Use your crystal ball. What do you see as America's role in the world over the next 5 years?
In the last 2 months, 3 months, I from east and west, from both the European continent, actually the Middle East, as well as out in the Western Pacific, I still get asked and for America to lead, and America leading in the Ukraine piece has been critical as well. And like it or not, I think that's who we are. That's what we've done in this structure that we've had since World War II. I think America, and we have our own challenges, there's no question about that, but that we are in a position to have the capability of leading like no other country in the world, and we should do that. And to the degree that we withdraw, isolate, if you will, to me, that just begets potential downsides, global downsides a place like Russia, a place like China, and other parts of the world that will eventually require our leadership. So I'm one that we need to stay engaged and lead as much as we possibly can. Not just do it by ourselves, with allies as well globally.
Admiral Mike Mullen, talking to you is like reading a wonderful book, and I've really enjoyed it again. It's
Thanks,
been wonderful
Warren.
to be with you. I'm sure our audience feels exactly the same way, and I want to thank you very much for being
Well,
here.
thank you, Warren. I've been interviewed. I've said this very publicly. I've been interviewed by a lot of people. No one matches you. I really mean that.
You're very
It's
kind.
true.
Well, we have a mutual admiration society. Then let's
Yeah.
let's put it that way. You're very kind, and thank you for that. I want to tell our audience what's coming next, and it's going to be the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Bret Stephens and Los Angeles Times columnist Pat Morrison, exploring an expert view of a topsy-turvy world, part 2. That's going to be next Wednesday, May 11th at 5 o'clock Pacific time. Thanks so much to all of you who have been listening and watching. Have a good time tonight and stay safe.